listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. In my season premiere earlier this month, I had an interview scheduled for that episode, but the guest I had scheduled was unable to appear for the interview on the day the interview was originally scheduled. The guest in question is Juliet Rose, and earlier today I had the honor of interviewing her. Juliet is the author of 4 books: Do-Over, We Don't Matter, Prick of the Needle, and Through the Surface, with a 5th book, Trigger Point, scheduled to be released tomorrow. I'm here with Juliet Rose, who is the author of 4 books: Do-Over, We Don't Matter, Prick of the Needle, and Through the Surface, and the author of the book Trigger Point, which is scheduled to release tomorrow. Juliet, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. Like you said, my name is Juliet, and I am a writer. I currently reside in Georgia, but I've lived all over the United States. I'm originally a native New Yorker. Also lived in Mexico as a child, so I do use some of those experiences in my writing. I do currently have 4 books out, with one coming out tomorrow. We're doing the last little minute things on those right now. But yeah, and then all of my books basically focus on what I call truth and fiction, or kind of bringing social commentary into fiction.
Now, without spoiling too much about each of your books, and you briefly went into this a little bit moments ago, but what are the 4 books you have out right now? Do-Over, We Don't Matter, Prick of the Needle, and Through the Surface about?
So Do-Over, kind of a brief summary, is a story about a woman who is dealing with an undiagnosed mental illness. She suffers from dissociative disorder. She doesn't know that. She just knows that she doesn't really connect. And she puts herself in situations that quite often are detrimental. And she finds herself in a situation where she runs. And so she runs and ends up in this beach town hundreds of miles away and decides to just start her life over there rather than facing what she's done. And through that, she starts to actually connect to people, which she never really has done, and finds that there's a ketamine abuse problem in the town with the youth. And so she becomes really invested in the people of that town, and has to decide if she's willing to stay and fight for them or if she's going to continue to run. We Don't Matter is an LGBTQ book, and it deals with, it deals with a lot of hot topics, including police brutality, church abuse. It has a lot to do with connection and the friendships that we form and standing up for what's right. Prick of the Needle deals with the prison wildland firefighting program, and one of the characters, the main character, is an ex-heroin addict that went to prison. And through that, she got involved with this program, and then when she was released, she continued on with the program. And so it has a lot to do with her fighting her heroin addiction, kind of a correlation between firefighting and that. And then, she ends up meeting another firefighter from the Navajo reservation, and it kind of tells their story about them dealing with their past and having to come together to move forward. Through the Surface is a little different. It's actually a supernatural horror book. I still tend to bring in real life situations into those, and so in this book, it starts out with a lot of tragedy. I kind of warn people that within the prologue, 4 people are dead. So it's one of these stories that starts out really kind of hard and heavy, and then picks up 15 years later and how it impacted the lives of these 2. At the time, they were teenagers, and now they're adults. And it brings them together on this island off the coast of Maine. They didn't know each other, but through meeting each other, it kind of brings all these forces of what happened back into their lives, including demonic forces. So that's the supernatural side. And they have to really decide how they're going to fight against these, and then come to realize that they were actually sent to fight against each other. And so those are the 4 books I currently have out now.
Now, on your website, you've noted that you've had a new book, Trigger Point, and I mentioned this at the start of the interview, that's scheduled to be released tomorrow. Now, without spoiling too much of it, what is Trigger Point about?
Yeah, Trigger Point will be coming out tomorrow, and Trigger Point is a story starting out about search and rescue in Montana. And this team, the search and rescue team in Montana, and they are getting a new dog handler who happens to be deaf. And so the story itself is about all of their experiences within what it's like to be in search and rescue in Montana, but specifically the main character, Zoe, she's their paramedic, and then the deaf dog handler, Micah, he comes, and it really kind of brings them together and their experiences, and then it deals with like a tragedy within it that drives everyone apart, and they have to basically figure out a way to come back together. So that one specifically deals with not only the search and rescue, but also something that's very important to me, which is dealing with disability in real life versus treating it as a trope.
Now, are all your books self-published, or all your books traditionally published, or are some self-published and others traditionally published?
So they are all now indie published. I was offered contracts on a few of my books, and because of the nature of what I write, I decided to turn those contracts down and put the books out myself, simply because I wanted that creative control over such sensitive topics. I didn't want something that would get altered or, I would be told not to put out. And so, after I had been offered contracts and really considered them, I decided that that was enough validation for me to move forward and to do this on my own.
Now, I will note for some of our listeners who might be new to the Heartland Author Podcast, self-publishing and indie publishing are basically two terms for the same concept.
Exactly. So self-publishing, some people use that individually, as they self-publish themselves, and then some of us form an independent publishing company, which is what I did. And then I use the term indie for that reason as well, but it is used somewhat interchangeably.
In addition to the books that you've written solo, you are also a contributing author to the horror anthology book Summer Slasher Horror Anthology Volume 1. What is it like working on an anthology project with many different authors?
Yeah, so it's really different, and I actually decided to submit my story to that horror anthology, and I hadn't written for many years, so this was kind of me cutting my teeth again and getting back into writing. And so I saw this publisher was doing a call out for stories for this horror anthology, and I had had this story that was rattling around in my brain for about 15 years. And so I took that story, wrote it down, and sent it in, and they accepted it. I didn't work directly with a lot of the other authors because they're from all over the country. So we didn't actually meet until the release, and then there was a few of us that were able to actually make that release and get to know each other through that.
Now, I am the type of person who is interested in reading horror books, but is extremely uncomfortable watching horror movies. I think I've watched like 5 minutes of one horror movie in my lifetime, and that was it for me. But yet I find horror books to be interesting reads. Now, do you enjoy watching horror movies, and do you have a strong preference either way for horror books or horror movies?
I actually am kind of like you in that I can watch a horror movie if it is not gory. Like if it's more of like a psychological and something like that, I can watch that. If it really gets into like the slasher type horror, I won't watch it. I do really enjoy horror books though.
Now, I was looking at a list of your books on Amazon while doing research for this podcast episode, and you've published 4 books in a span of 9 months. Excuse me. Are you someone who, like me, works on multiple book writing projects at the same time? And if not, what is your typical writing routine like?
I don't work on multiple ones at a time because I'm one of these people that really has to work A to Z, so I have to start something and finish it before I can really start a new project. So while those were published in a shorter span of time, they actually were written over a longer period of time and then published. I write one book. So when I'm working on a novel, that's what I work on. And I do the research, and then I'll set it aside, and then I'll often work on editing or something at the same time. So currently right now, I've been working on editing for Trigger Point. I'm also writing another novel. So I'll do that because it's 2 different gears, but I can't do 2 books themselves at the same time.
Now, as it stands right now, only one of your books, Through the Surface, is available on Kindle Unlimited. What are your thoughts about Kindle Unlimited as an author, and why did you decide to make one of your books available on Kindle Unlimited instead of none or all of them?
So what I'll do initially when a book is published is I'll let it be on Kindle Unlimited for the first window, which is 3 months. And then typically I'll pull it off Kindle Unlimited because if it gives time to kind of get people that are interested to get out there and read it and start to build that, momentum. And then I usually pull it off and so that they can purchase it then, but not have it on Kindle Unlimited. I kept through the service on simply because it's horror and we're coming up on Halloween. So I figured I'd let it ride that next segment, which is the 3 months through Halloween.
Now, on your author website, you noted that you are a New York native. I mean, you mentioned this when I asked you to introduce yourself, but that you're a New York native living in the mountains of Georgia. How much of a culture shock was it for you to go from living in New York to living in Georgia?
It is a lot of a culture shock. Luckily, I was raised, my mother was a bit of a hippie, and so we did live in an RV for part of my childhood, and we traveled around the country. And then my ex-husband was in the military, so I also traveled around quite a bit with him and got to live in a lot of different places. So it wasn't a direct from New York to Georgia, which was helpful. However, that being said, knowing both cultures, it is a very different shift. Living in New York versus living here. Here there's a lot of different belief systems. There's a lot of different ways of people dealing with each other. So, I tend to be somewhat introverted, which is fine, and I keep to myself. But it definitely was a culture shock.
Well, Juliet, I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, and I hope the release of Trigger Point goes well for you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about my books and get to know me a little bit better.
You're welcome. I enjoyed interviewing Juliet, and I wish her well on the release of her new book tomorrow. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2022, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.